The call came in less than 60 seconds ago. Not an hour. Not yesterday. Not breaking overnight. 60 seconds. And the words on the screen stopped everyone who saw them cold. 2 bodies. A famous home. A knife. And a name the world thought it knew. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How does a Hollywood legend end up at the center of a death report so violent that even veteran investigators reportedly had to step outside to breathe? And more importantly, why did the earliest reports leave out the most disturbing details? Because what you're about to hear isn't just about a death. It's about a family implosion, a reputation rewritten in blood, and 13 horrifying details buried deep inside a report that was never meant to go viral. Let me ask you something before we go any further. If you woke up tomorrow and the internet told you that one of the most recognizable figures in American film history had been brutally killed inside their own home, would you believe it? Most people did, because the story arrived fully formed. Police tape imagery, medical examiner language, courtroom sketches, a son in handcuffs. It felt real. Too real. And that's exactly why this story matters right now. This isn't just a tale of violence. It's a case study in how quickly perception becomes truth, and how little time it takes for a narrative to spiral out of control. By the time authorities even finished notifying extended family members, the public had already decided what happened. But here's the first contradiction no one talks about. The earliest versions of the report didn't agree on the time of death. Some said early morning. Others said late afternoon. One claimed the night before. How could a case with such high visibility have such basic inconsistencies from the very start? That question alone should have slowed everything down. It didn't. Instead, headlines escalated. Words like horrifying, brutal, and unthinkable began appearing within minutes. Then came the detail that changed the emotional temperature of the entire story. The suspect wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't a random act. It was their own son. And suddenly, this wasn't just a crime story anymore. It became a family tragedy, a psychological mystery, a media firestorm, and a morality play played out in real time. But before we go any further, you need to understand who these people were in the public imagination. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was the safe voice, the familiar face, the man associated with warmth, wit, and cultural memory. Decades of work had turned him into something larger than a person. He was an institution. And Michelle Singer Reiner, his wife, lived mostly outside the spotlight, but not entirely. Those close to them described her as observant, quietly creative, protective of her family, which raises an uncomfortable question. How does a household that appeared so stable on the surface descend into violence so extreme that the medical examiner would later use language reserved for the most severe cases? Because when the cause of death was finally released, it wasn't vague. It wasn't softened. It was clinical, cold, explicit, multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. No poetic phrasing. No ambiguity. Just facts that landed like blunt instruments. And then came the date. Sunday, December 14th. A single day that would be referenced again and again, but never explained the same way twice. Some reports claimed the bodies were discovered after a welfare check. Others said a family member found them. Still others quietly edited their timelines without explanation. That's detail number 1. The story was changing while people were already reacting to it. And then came the second chilling revelation. The house itself. A quiet Brentwood property. High hedges. Privacy gates. The kind of place designed to keep the world out. And yet, whatever happened inside those walls was violent enough to leave physical evidence that investigators allegedly described as impossible to ignore. Think about that for a second. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of panic gone wrong. Whatever occurred unfolded over time, which leads us to a question no headline dared to ask. How long did it take? Minutes? An hour? Longer? And who knew what was happening while it was happening? According to early accounts, neighbors heard nothing unusual. No screams, no alarms, no sounds of struggle, which doesn't align with the severity described later. That contradiction would quietly disappear from most coverage within hours. But it matters. Because silence, in a case like this, is never just silence. It's absence. And absence always invites speculation. Then came the arrest. Nick Reiner. The name alone detonated across social media. Photos pulled from old interviews. Graduation pictures. Smiling family snapshots reinterpreted with ominous captions. Everyone became an expert overnight. Armchair psychologists. Body language analysts. People who had never met him suddenly certain they understood everything. But here's the detail that didn't trend. Nick wasn't arrested at the scene. He was located later. Where he was found, and how, would become one of the most quietly disputed elements of the entire case. Some sources said he surrendered voluntarily. Others implied he was tracked. Still others suggested a delay that raised uncomfortable questions about what happened between the deaths and the arrest. That's detail number 3. Time gaps. And time gaps are where truth tends to hide. When Nick finally appeared in court, reporters described a scene that felt almost surreal. He was shielded from public view, shackled, wearing a suicide prevention vest. He spoke only once. "Yes, Your Honor." That was it. No statement. No explanation. No visible emotion that could be easily interpreted. And the public filled in the blanks themselves. Was he detached? Was he medicated? Was he coached? Or was he simply in shock? Because shock doesn't always look like grief. Sometimes it looks like nothing at all. And that unsettled people more than tears ever could. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because buried inside the medical examiner's report were details that didn't make the initial news cycle. Details that would later be described as deeply disturbing by those who read the full document. Details that suggested escalation. Not a single moment. Not a snap. But a progression. Which raises a terrifying possibility. If this wasn't spontaneous, then what was it? And who noticed the warning signs before it was too late? Friends would later claim there were none. Family acquaintances said everything seemed normal. But normal is a word people often use when they're looking backward and trying to make sense of something that already happened. Normal doesn't mean safe. And silence doesn't mean peace. This is where the story stops being about one night and starts being about everything that came before it. The unseen tensions. The unspoken resentments. The private moments no camera ever captured. Because tragedies like this don't erupt out of nothing. They simmer. And by the time they boil over, it's already too late. But here's the most unsettling part of all. The full list of details, the 13 specific elements contained in that report, weren't released all at once. They emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, and each one reframed the entire narrative. What people thought they understood on day 1 didn't survive day 3. And by the time the final details surfaced, the story had transformed into something far more complex and far more disturbing than a simple headline could ever convey. So let me ask you this. What if the most horrifying part of this case isn't the violence itself, but how easily everyone accepted the first version of the story without questioning what was missing? Because what comes next forces us to confront not just what happened inside that house, but how close any carefully constructed life can be to collapse. And when we move into the first chapter, we're going to examine the earliest hours after the discovery, the moments when facts were still fluid, narratives were still forming, and one small decision set off a chain reaction no one could stop. But what investigators noticed in those first hours would quietly haunt the entire case. And it's something almost no one saw coming. The house was supposed to be quiet. It was a Sunday afternoon in Brentwood, the kind of day that barely registers on the calendar. No premieres, no meetings, no noise. The kind of stillness that wealthy neighborhoods pride themselves on. Birds, lawns, gates that never squeak. That's why what happened next felt so wrong. The first person to arrive wasn't police. It wasn't a reporter. It was family. Rob Reiner had come by because something felt off. That's how it always starts, isn't it? Not with evidence. Not with alarms. With a feeling. Calls unanswered. Texts unread. A silence that stretches just long enough to make you uneasy, but not long enough to justify panic. Yet, ask yourself this. How many times have you ignored that instinct because you didn't want to seem dramatic? Romy didn't. She drove to the house. High hedges. Closed gates. Nothing visibly wrong. From the outside, the home looked exactly the same as it had the last 100 times. No broken windows. No forced entry. No signs of chaos. And that's what made the moment she stepped inside so jarring. Because the first thing she noticed wasn't what she saw. It was what she didn't hear. No television. No music. No movement. The house felt hollow, like the sound had been drained out of it. She called out. No response. That's when the unease turned into fear, and then into something worse. The exact sequence of what Romy saw next has never been fully described in public. Different sources phrase it differently. Some avoid specifics altogether. Others use careful language that dances around the reality. But all of them agree on one thing. Once she understood what she was looking at, there was no undoing it. Two bodies. Her parents. Inside their own home. The shock of that moment is almost impossible to articulate. Not just grief, but disbelief. The brain refusing to accept the information it's being fed. The surreal sense that you've stepped into someone else's nightmare. And here's a detail that matters. Romy didn't immediately run. She didn't scream for help. She froze. That's not speculation. That's consistent with trauma response. Because when the mind encounters something that shatters reality, it often pauses, as if waiting for the world to correct itself. It doesn't. Eventually, she called authorities. And when the first responders arrived, the tone of the day changed instantly. Because within minutes, this was no longer a family emergency. It was a homicide scene. The house was sealed. Tape went up. Patrol cars appeared. And inside, investigators began documenting what they would later describe as one of the most disturbing domestic crime scenes they'd encountered in years. But here's the thing most people don't realize. The earliest hours of an investigation are chaotic. Facts are incomplete. Assumptions are dangerous. Every detail is provisional. And yet, those first impressions shape everything that comes after. One of the first questions investigators ask in cases like this is simple. Is there a suspect inside the house? There wasn't. No one hiding. No injured third party. No immediate threat. Which immediately ruled out several possibilities. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Nothing appeared stolen. Valuables were still in place. That alone shifted the focus inward. Family, close contacts, people with access. And access was the key word. Because there were no signs of forced entry. No broken doors. No smash locks. Whoever did this had been let in. Or already belonged there. That realization narrowed the universe of suspects dramatically. And it also introduced the first wave of fear that rippled through the investigators themselves. Because crimes like this don't happen without proximity. And proximity implies familiarity. As forensic teams moved through the house, they began marking evidence. Carefully, methodically, photographing angles most people would never want to imagine. And it was during this process that the severity of the injuries became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a single wound. It wasn't even a few. The language later used in the report would be multiple sharp force injuries. But that clinical phrasing doesn't capture what that actually means in practice. It means repetition. It means escalation. It means time. And time is the most disturbing element of all. Because this didn't happen in an instant. This wasn't a single uncontrollable outburst. There were pauses. Moments where it could have stopped. It didn't. Which raises a question that still haunts this case. What was happening emotionally in that room? Anger? Desperation? Fear? Or something colder? Something calculated? Investigators also noticed something else early on. The locations of the bodies. They weren't found together. They weren't posed. They were separated by space within the home, which suggested movement, pursuit, or an attempt to escape. That detail alone reframed the entire narrative, because it meant this wasn't contained to one spot. It unfolded, room by room, and that's when the house itself became part of the story. The layout, the corridors, the exits, each one told a piece of the sequence, and each piece made the picture darker. Meanwhile, outside, something else was happening. Word began to spread, not officially, not through press releases, but through whispers. Police radios crackle. Neighbors notice activity. Someone posts a vague message online. And within hours, speculation ignited. At first, no names were released. Just that it involved a well-known figure. That was enough. People connected dots. Guessed. Posted. By the time confirmation arrived, the internet had already written its own version of events. But back inside the house, investigators were facing a more pressing question. Where was Nick? The son. His absence was immediate and conspicuous. Phones were checked. Calls placed. No response. And this is where timelines begin to blur. Because depending on which account you read, the delay between discovery and Nick being located varies. Some say hours. Others say longer. What everyone agrees on is that during that window, the case shifted from tragic to terrifying. Because until Nick was found, no one knew whether the threat was contained. And then there's this detail. Nick's car was not at the house, which meant he had left. When? Before the incident? After? In a state of panic? Or with intent? That question sat heavy over the investigation, and it shaped how every subsequent action was taken. When police eventually located Nick, the atmosphere was already charged. This wasn't a routine arrest. This was the collapse of a public family. A son taken into custody for the deaths of his parents. And yet, even at this stage, not all officers agreed on what they were dealing with. Some saw the evidence and believed the case was clear. Others were unsettled by inconsistencies. Details that didn't line up perfectly. Small things. The kind that get overlooked when the story seems obvious. But those small things have a way of becoming very important later. As night fell on Brentwood, the house remained sealed. Lights on inside. Darkness outside. A glowing box of tragedy surrounded by silence. And somewhere, a young man sat in custody, not yet having said a word. No statement. No explanation. Just the weight of everything that had happened pressing in. The media would soon descend. Experts would soon speculate. But in those first hours, there was only shock and confusion, and a growing realization among investigators that this case was not going to be simple. Because the deeper they looked at the scene, the more it contradicted the assumptions being made outside those walls. And the next phase of the investigation would force everyone to confront a possibility far more unsettling than a straightforward act of violence. A possibility hidden in the timeline itself. Because when forensic analysts began narrowing down the estimated time of death, they uncovered a discrepancy that would ripple through the entire case. And once you hear it, you'll understand why nothing about this story was ever going to stay straightforward. The problem with timelines is that they don't lie quietly. They sit there, rigid, unforgiving. And when something doesn't line up, it nags at everyone who touches the case. That's exactly what happened here. Because within the first 24 hours, investigators believed they had a rough window for when the deaths occurred. Not exact, not precise, but close enough to begin reconstructing the sequence of events. Then the forensic estimates came back, and everything shifted. The initial assumption had been simple. The deaths occurred sometime Sunday morning. That fit the discovery. It fit the family check-in. It fit the idea that this was a recent, contained incident. But the medical examiner's preliminary findings complicated that narrative. Body temperature, rigor, early lividity patterns. None of it screamed Sunday morning. In fact, some indicators suggested the deaths could have occurred earlier than anyone wanted to admit. Saturday night, possibly even earlier. That discrepancy might sound minor. It wasn't, because it raised a question that immediately split the investigation in two. If the deaths happened earlier, why hadn't anyone noticed? No emergency calls. No neighbors reporting disturbances. No security alerts. The house was quiet. Too quiet. And now investigators had to consider the possibility that the bodies had been inside that house longer than originally thought, which meant something else entirely. Time. Time for evidence to shift. Time for a suspect to move. Time for decisions to be made. And if time had passed, then someone had known something was wrong and didn't act. Or worse, someone had time to act deliberately. This is where the case stopped feeling reactive and started feeling constructed. Investigators began combing through phone records. Not just calls. Metadata. Pings. Usage patterns. When was the last time Ray's phone was unlocked? When was Michelle's device last active? Those timestamps didn't align cleanly with the public story. Ray's phone activity stopped abruptly late Saturday evening. Michelle showed a brief burst of interaction afterward, then silence. That detail alone suggested two separate moments. Two separate events, which contradicted the idea of a single, sudden outburst. If one person's phone went dark before the other, then something happened in stages. And stages imply control. As analysts worked, another unsettling fact emerged. The house's internal security system had been partially disabled. Not destroyed. Not smashed. Adjusted. Certain sensors were inactive. Others were still live. Which means whoever altered the system knew how it worked. They didn't panic. They navigated. They selected. And that discovery erased the comforting illusion that this was chaotic or impulsive. This was someone moving with intention. Meanwhile, outside the forensic bubble, the narrative had already hardened. The public believed they knew what happened. Sun snaps. Tragedy unfolds. Justice follows. Clean. Digestible. Emotionally satisfying. But real investigations are never that neat. Inside the department, debates intensified. One camp believed the discrepancies were explainable. Temperature variations. Environmental factors. Human error. Another camp wasn't convinced. They believed the timeline problem was the story. Because if the deaths occurred earlier, it opened a dangerous line of inquiry. Who saw them last? And when? Ray had spoken to a colleague Friday evening. Michelle had exchanged messages with a friend early Saturday. After that, nothing. No social posts. No outgoing calls. No routine check-ins. Yet no one sounded the alarm, which tells you something about how insulated their lives were, and how isolation can hide things longer than anyone expects. Investigators turned their attention to the son's movements. Nick's phone data told a story, but not a clean one. Location pings placed him near the house during the estimated window. Then away. Then briefly back. Then gone again. Why return? That single question fueled hours of debate. Was he checking something? Retrieving something? Or was the data misleading? Because here's the truth about digital footprints. They're precise, but they're not infallible. Signal drift. Cell tower overlap. False certainty. Still, the pattern was hard to ignore, especially when paired with another detail that quietly surfaced. A neighbor's security camera captured a vehicle leaving the area late Saturday night. The footage was grainy, time-stamped, not clear enough to identify the driver, but clear enough to identify the car model. And it matched Nick's. That was the moment when the investigation tightened, because now the timeline discrepancy had teeth. This wasn't just an academic debate. It suggested opportunity, and possibly premeditation. Yet even here, nothing was straightforward. Because the timestamp on the footage didn't perfectly match the phone data. A few minutes off. Enough to introduce doubt. Enough to prevent certainty. And doubt is dangerous in a case like this. Doubt gives space for alternative explanations. Investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to the estimated time of death. Who was in the house? Who wasn't? Were there arguments? Texts hinted at tension. Not explosive. Subtle. A short reply where there used to be warmth. A missed call that wasn't returned. The kind of microfractures that mean nothing until everything breaks. And then there was the knife. The alleged weapon. Recovered from the scene. Cleaned. Not scrubbed spotless. But handled. Which means it had been touched after use. And if it had been touched, someone had the presence of mind to think about it. That alone contradicted the image of a blind rage. Rage doesn't clean. Rage doesn't pause. Rage doesn't disable security sensors. This was something else. As the hours passed, pressure mounted. The department wanted answers. The public wanted closure. The family wanted silence. Nick said nothing. Not during questioning. Not during processing. Not when informed of the charges. Silence can mean many things. Shock, guilt, legal advice, or something darker, something strategic. And the longer he stayed silent, the more the story grew around him. The narrative filled the gaps he left. But here's the detail that still unsettles those closest to the case. Nick asked one question. Just one. He didn't ask how his parents were. He didn't ask what was happening. He asked about the timeline. Specifically, what time investigators believed the deaths occurred. That question landed like a dropped glass in a quiet room. Because it suggested awareness. Awareness of time. And awareness of time is not something you expect from someone completely blindsided by tragedy. Was he trying to understand the charges? Or was he checking alignment? Investigators noted it, filed it, didn't comment publicly. But internally, it changed how they viewed everything. By the time Nick appeared in court, the timeline issue was already a fault line running through the case. The prosecution presented a clean version. Sunday discovery. Immediate arrest. Clear cause. The defense would later hint at something messier. Earlier time of death. Inconsistent estimates. Unreliable assumptions. And in between those two narratives sat the truth. Complicated. Uncomfortable. Still forming. As the medical examiner finalized the report, some of the early ambiguity was clarified. But not all of it. Because even final reports have margins of error. And those margins were wide enough to drive reasonable doubt through. Yet the most unsettling aspect of the timeline wasn't when the deaths occurred. It was how much time passed between them. Because evidence suggested they did not happen simultaneously. Minutes. Possibly longer. Which means one person was alive after the other was already gone. Alone. in the same house, with the same person. Let that sink in, and ask yourself the question no one wanted to ask out loud. If someone had time between acts, what were they thinking? What decision was made in that space? Because that moment, that pause between violence, tells you more about intent than any weapon ever could. As investigators prepared to move forward, they knew one thing. The timeline was going to be attacked, dissected, used, and whatever happened next would hinge on whether the story of time held up under scrutiny. But just as the department was bracing for that battle, a new detail emerged from the forensic analysis. A detail that didn't just complicate the timeline, it threatened to collapse it entirely. Because it suggested the possibility of someone else being present in the house during a critical window. And once that idea entered the investigation, nothing would ever look the same again. There is a moment in every investigation when someone asks the question everyone else is trying not to hear. What if there was someone else? Not a theory whispered online, not a rumor pushed by commentators. A real, procedural question asked inside a room full of professionals who understand exactly what it implies. Because once you introduce the possibility of an additional presence, everything fractures. Motives multiply, timelines destabilize, certainty evaporates. And that question didn't come from a defense attorney. It came from a forensic analyst staring at a pattern that didn't quite belong. The analyst had been reviewing trace evidence, foot impressions, smear directions, transfer marks. The small, easily dismissed details that only start to matter when nothing else makes sense. And one thing stood out. There were inconsistencies in movement. Not dramatic, not obvious, but subtle enough to suggest that at least one set of actions inside the house didn't match the height, gait, or reach of the primary suspect. At first, the idea was dismissed. Variability, stress movement, adrenaline. Those explanations cover a lot. Until they don't. Because the analyst noticed something else. A partial print in a corridor that led away from one of the rooms. Not a shoe print in the traditional sense. More like a transfer pattern. Barely there. As if someone had stepped, paused, and shifted weight. And the spacing didn't match Nick's known stride. That alone wouldn't have been enough. But paired with the earlier timeline discrepancies, it created a problem. Because if someone else had been there, even briefly, then the case narrative collapsed. Investigators argued. Some insisted the print was meaningless. Others pointed out that ignoring anomalies is how cases fail later. Eventually, the decision was made to quietly explore the possibility without alerting the press. No public statements. No leaks. Just questions. Who had access to the house? Not just keys. Codes. Garage remotes. Temporary permissions. House staff. Friends. Service providers. And here's where the story took an unexpected turn. The Reiners had recently changed their security system. Upgraded it. Which meant installers had been in the house within weeks of the incident. Names were pulled. Schedules reviewed. Alibis checked. Every one of them cleared. But the process uncovered something else. The system logs showed an entry event that didn't align with any known family member's access pattern. A door opened and closed during a window when no one was supposed to be there. Could it have been an error? Yes. Could it have been a sensor glitch? Possibly. But investigators couldn't ignore it. Because the timestamp matched the ambiguous window between the two estimated times of death. That coincidence alone forced a deeper look. Phone records were revisited. Not just Nick's. Everyone's. Incoming numbers. Missed calls. Blocked contacts. And that's when they found it. A call to Michelle's phone that lasted less than 10 seconds. Unknown number. Burner level anonymity. Placed during the critical window. Not answered, but registered. Why would someone call the house at that time? And why didn't they call back? The call didn't prove anything, but it added another thread to a tapestry that was already unraveling. Investigators debated whether to pursue it aggressively, because opening that door meant potentially widening the suspect pool, and the department was already under scrutiny. A famous family, media pressure, public outrage. There was appetite for closure, not complexity. But the evidence didn't care about appetite. It just existed. And the more they looked, the more they realized how dangerous assumptions can be. Another detail surfaced. One of the kitchen drawers had been opened and closed after the estimated time of death. Not rummaged, just accessed, which suggests someone was looking for something specific. And finding something specific requires knowledge. That drawer wasn't commonly used. Family members confirmed it. So who knew what was inside? And why did they need it after everything else had already happened? Theories began to circulate internally. An accomplice? A witness? Someone trying to help? Someone trying to hide? None of them sat comfortably, because every theory introduced consequences that rippled outward. If someone else was involved, even peripherally, then Nick's silence took on a different meaning. Was he protecting someone? Or was he unaware of something that happened around him? Because silence isn't always strategy. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes it's fear. And sometimes it's the realization that the story you're about to tell won't be believed anyway. Investigators attempted to reconstruct a scenario where another person entered the house, interacted briefly, and left without being detected. It was possible, difficult, but not impossible, especially in a house designed for privacy. The problem was motive. Why would someone else be there? And why would they vanish? No stolen property. No signs of struggle involving a third party. Just hints. Fragments. The kind of evidence that never quite coalesces. Which is why some investigators pushed back hard. They argued that chasing ghosts would weaken the case. That juries want clarity. That prosecutors need a clean narrative. And they were right. But they were also uneasy. Because clean narratives have a habit of cracking under pressure. Meanwhile, the media narrative marched forward without hesitation. The Sun had done it. Case closed. Anything else was noise. But inside the investigation, doubt had already taken root. And doubt changes how you see everything. Every photo, every statement, every silence. Nick's court appearance only intensified that feeling. He remained hidden from view. Shackled. Vest on. He answered only when required. Observers described him as distant. But distance can mean many things. Trauma, medication, or the knowledge that speaking would make things worse. Behind the scenes, defense attorneys were already requesting discovery. They wanted the full forensic picture, including the anomalies, including the timeline debates, including the possibility of another presence. The prosecution resisted, not because they were hiding something, but because they feared confusion. Confusion is the enemy of conviction. And yet, suppressing complexity has its own risks. Because when juries sense something is being simplified, they push back. As the weeks passed, the possibility of another person faded from public view. It was never confirmed, never denied, just quietly sidelined. But it left a residue, a discomfort that lingered beneath the surface of the case. Because once you allow for the idea that not everything is accounted for, you can't unsee it. And the investigators who saw it carried that weight. Especially when the autopsy details came back more fully. Details that suggested not just violence, but interaction, defensive wounds, angle variations, signs of movement during the act. All consistent with a struggle, but also consistent with intervention. Someone stepping in, someone hesitating, someone present long enough to change outcomes, but not long enough to leave clarity. And that's the most terrifying kind of presence. The one that leaves just enough trace to haunt the record. As the case moved forward, the official narrative solidified. Charges were filed. Dates were set. Statements were prepared. But beneath it all, the unanswered questions remained. And one investigator summed it up privately with a sentence that never left the room. If there was someone else, even for a minute, then we're not telling the whole truth. And the truth, partial or complete, has a way of resurfacing. Sometimes years later. Sometimes at the worst possible moment. Because the next phase of this story wouldn't be shaped by evidence alone. It would be shaped by perception, by how the public interpreted silence, by how a jury would read ambiguity, and by how one family's private tragedy had already been transformed into a spectacle. The courtroom was a theater, not in the sense of performance, though cameras and reporters made it feel that way, but in the sense of tension. Every breath measured, every movement scrutinized, every silence loaded with meaning. Nick Reiner entered, shackled, wearing a suicide prevention vest. He barely looked around, his gaze fixed, almost robotic, as if the weight of what had happened had already consumed him. Only one word escaped his lips that day. Yes, Your Honor. That was it. One syllable. One acknowledgement of the court's authority. No explanation. No defense. No display of emotion that anyone could decode. Just silence. And silence, in situations like this, is loud. The press immediately interpreted it. Social media exploded. Headlines varied wildly. Some called him cold. Others called him traumatized. Armchair psychologists dissected posture, hand placement, facial tension. In minutes, a narrative had formed that would become almost impossible to dislodge. But the reality inside the courtroom was far more complicated. The judge's first task was procedural, ensuring Nick understood his rights. He did, but that compliance only raised more questions. Could someone so composed under extreme circumstances also have been capable of the acts alleged? Was this an indicator of guilt or simply shock? Defense attorneys and prosecutors began their dance. Every word, every phrasing, every motion mattered. This wasn't just about law. It was about perception, about setting the stage for what the jury would later see, hear, and ultimately believe. And the first twist came from something subtle: the handling of the evidence. Prosecutors presented preliminary medical examiner findings. Clinical, cold, multiple sharp force injuries, they said. Homicide, they declared. Straightforward, precise. But behind the dry language lurked questions that were never addressed aloud. How many wounds? Were there defensive injuries? Was there evidence of hesitation, movement, struggle? Each question created a ripple. Each ripple would later expand into full-blown debate. The defense, constrained at this early stage, could do little beyond observing. But their presence alone kept the courtroom in tension. They asked about the timing, about procedure, about inconsistencies in public reports, small cracks in the story that hinted at complexity the media would never capture in headlines. And then came the media's intrusion. Reporters crowded the corridors. Cameras outside captured nothing new but suggested drama simply by proximity. Social media amplified every whisper. By the end of the first hearing, public opinion had already solidified into certainty. Nick did it. Case closed. Yet inside the courtroom, subtle contradictions quietly emerged. Witnesses appeared, each carefully managed, each giving carefully crafted testimony. And while none contradicted the official narrative, small details, like a pause in the timeline, a mismatched recollection of events, began to accumulate. One witness noted that Nick had been calm in the days prior. Another described tension in the family home. A neighbor claimed to see someone near the property at a time inconsistent with early reports. These fragments were small, seemingly insignificant. But when stacked together, they created the sense of a story far more layered than any headline could capture. And the courtroom itself amplified drama. The architecture, the arrangement of seats, the way reporters and spectators clustered. It all created an environment where tension was tangible. Every glance, every shuffled paper, every murmur resonated as if it had weight far beyond its size. Public perception, of course, didn't wait for facts. It leaped ahead. Social media speculation was already assigning motive, intent, and personality. Every gesture Nick made was analyzed, every silence interpreted, and in the absence of clear explanation, the human brain filled gaps with narrative. Meanwhile, back inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. The prosecution, aware of public scrutiny, had to proceed with caution. Presenting evidence too early could taint the jury pool, but withholding it risked appearing evasive. Every word measured, every detail considered. And when the first procedural hurdle was cleared, the focus shifted to the arraignment. Not yet the trial, not yet the detailed arguments, but enough to set the stage, enough to hint at the drama to come. Nick was led away in handcuffs. Behind him, reporters whispered. Cameras clicked. And outside, the public consumed the drama, constructing a narrative faster than the legal process could clarify. Inside, investigators quietly worried. Not about guilt, not about the evidence, not about law, about the cracks, the little things the public would never see. The inconsistencies in the timeline, the traces of another presence, the questions left unanswered. Those were the pieces that could derail even the most straightforward narrative. And the most unsettling element of all, Nick's silence, not because it indicated guilt, but because it left space. Space for interpretation, space for doubt, space for fear. And in cases like this, that space is dangerous. Because human minds, especially in juries, are drawn to narratives that make sense. They prefer closure, certainty. But this case offered ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable. Which is why the courtroom drama of the first hearing wasn't just legal theater, it was emotional theater, psychological theater. The first act in a play whose ending no one could predict. The press would portray Nick one way, the public another. But investigators, prosecutors, and defense attorneys understood the truth. Every nuance mattered. Every detail, no matter how small, could tip the balance. By the time the hearing ended, the world thought they had clarity. But the reality was different. Because in the next chapter, we will examine the 13 horrifying details buried in the report. Details that the media initially omitted. Details that would challenge everything the public believed. Details that would finally force everyone to confront the true scale of the tragedy. And when those details emerged, they shocked even those closest to the investigation. When the full medical examiner's report was finally released to the investigators, it didn't arrive as a neatly packaged story. It arrived as fragments. Details. Observations. Each one clinical in tone, precise, but horrifying in implication. 13 details in total. 13 elements that, taken together, transformed what seemed like a tragic but understandable event into something far more disturbing. And the first 5 details alone set the tone. Detail 1, multiple sharp force injuries. The report was explicit. Not a single wound. Not a fleeting incident. Multiple. In different locations. On different victims. The very phrasing suggested repetition, intent, and escalation. Investigators stared at the pages. Clinicians explained that the distribution of injuries implied movement, perhaps even struggle. And that small observation mattered. Because struggle implies awareness. Awareness implies intent. It also raised a horrifying possibility. One victim may have experienced the attack over a longer duration than the other. And that prolonged exposure intensified the trauma. Detail 2, defensive wounds. Hands, arms, fingers. Subtle injuries meant to protect oneself. But they told a story. The story of someone aware, someone fighting, someone attempting to survive. Investigators noted these wounds as evidence of the victim's final moments, silent witnesses to the violence. Detail 3, angles of attack. Each injury had a trajectory. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. Certain angles suggested movement. Certain angles suggested hesitation or pause. Patterns emerged that hinted at interaction between the assailant and victims. Something almost choreographed, almost deliberate in its execution. Detail 4, signs of movement. Beyond the injuries, the report documented traces suggesting victims or the perpetrator moved during the act. Smears, displaced objects, furniture subtly rearranged. Each small clue reinforced the idea that this wasn't a single moment. This was a process, a sequence, and sequence implies time, and time implies decisions. Detail 5, location of bodies. Separated, not positioned for display, but indicative of pursuit or an attempt to escape. One body in the living room, another in the study. The separation suggested the victims did not die simultaneously. One may have witnessed what happened to the other before succumbing. And the psychological implications of that are profound. Investigators paused. They understood that these first 5 details alone painted a picture of extreme horror. A family tragedy far beyond what public headlines suggested. But even as they processed these elements, they knew the report contained 8 more details, each potentially more unsettling than the last. At this point, investigators also began connecting these details to the timeline discrepancies identified earlier. If the victims were moving during the attacks, the estimated times of death might be longer than initially assumed. Each second, each movement, each interaction compounded the severity. And then there was the knife, the alleged weapon, not just a single implement. Evidence suggested precision, clean cuts, strategic use, not haphazard, not desperate. That fact alone reframed the narrative from outburst to calculated action. The first 5 details combined told a story, but it was a story that the media hadn't captured, that the public hadn't imagined. Headlines screamed tragedy, but they omitted process, intention, interaction, and escalation. Investigators began to share the findings with the prosecution. Every word mattered. Every phrasing could influence future court arguments. And the prosecution was keenly aware that public perception had already taken hold. They needed the report to align with evidence, but also to preserve clarity for jurors. As they dissected these 5 details, a disturbing realization emerged. This wasn't merely a family tragedy. This was a window into human behavior under extreme conditions, a study in escalation, proximity, and decision-making under pressure. Each detail was clinical, but its emotional resonance was undeniable. And yet, investigators held their breath, because the remaining 8 details had the potential to amplify this horror exponentially. One by one, these next details would challenge assumptions, force the team to reconsider motives, interactions, and psychological states. And most importantly, they would force a confrontation with the unsettling possibility that the public's version of events, as it currently stood, was dangerously incomplete. The first 5 details had been horrifying. They set the tone. They demanded attention. The first 5 details had set the stage. They revealed repeated sharp injuries, defensive wounds, angles of attack, movement, and the separation of the victims' bodies. But the next 8 details turned the horror from disturbing to almost unthinkable. Detail 6, the order of attacks. The forensic team determined that the sequence of injuries suggested one victim was attacked before the other. The medical examiner noted variations in wound severity, placement, and defensive responses that indicated a progression. One victim had moments to see what was happening to the other. Investigators immediately recognized the psychological weight of this. Exposure to violence before succumbing leaves a mark, even if the victim dies within minutes. It indicates awareness, fear, and perhaps the harrowing realization of inevitability. Detail 7, the state of the crime scene. Unlike many domestic homicides, this scene contained clues of deliberate action. Objects were shifted, seemingly moved to facilitate the attacks or impede escape. Certain items showed fingerprints inconsistent with the victims or the alleged perpetrators. This suggested someone, either the perpetrator or another presence, interacted with the environment in ways that were neither chaotic nor accidental. Detail 8. Trace evidence anomalies. Investigators discovered smudges, partial prints, and faint fibers inconsistent with the family's routine movements. Some of these anomalies could not be linked to anyone officially present in the household at the time. Internal debate ensued. Was this contamination, or did it suggest a third-party presence? Though unconfirmed, the possibility added a layer of tension. The team labeled it inconclusive but suspicious, a designation that haunted subsequent analysis. Detail 9. The weapon's handling. The knife used to inflict the injuries was examined in excruciating detail. It showed precise, almost deliberate use. Not an impulsive strike. Not a flailing motion. Each incision reflected control. The clean cuts, consistent depth, and patterns suggested planning, or at least focused intent. Investigators couldn't ignore that this alone contradicted early media speculation about an emotionally impulsive act. Detail 10. Signs of hesitation. Within the wound patterns, forensic specialists detected what they called hesitation marks. Minor surface cuts indicating pauses between attacks, moments where the assailant's hand lingered or redirected. This finding reinforced the theory of interaction and decision-making during the act. It implied thought, control, or deliberation, an unsettling conclusion when combined with previous details. Detail 11. Minor but telling injuries. Bruising inconsistent with defensive action, superficial cuts on non-critical areas, and faint marks on surfaces suggested interactions not captured in early accounts. Investigators speculated these may have been defensive or indicative of struggle, or they could reflect an attempt to stage elements of the scene. Whatever the interpretation, these minor details layered complexity onto an already horrifying picture. Detail 12. The psychological indicators. The combination of movement, sequence, hesitation, and interactions revealed behavioral patterns. It hinted at a calculated method, or at least an awareness of consequences. Investigators consulted behavioral specialists, who noted that while not all cases of domestic homicide show such layered interaction, when they do, it often suggests a relationship of deep familiarity, premeditation, and a chilling detachment during execution. Detail 13. Evidence of post-attack activity. Certain objects and minor traces indicated that after the acts, the scene was adjusted, intentionally or subconsciously. The placement of items, slight alterations in the layout, and clean surfaces suggested awareness of the aftermath. Some investigators hypothesized attempts to hide evidence, others to navigate the environment after trauma. Either interpretation painted a scenario far more complex than a single, impulsive moment. Taken together, these 13 details transformed the case from a narrative of shocking violence into a study in escalation, proximity, intention, and human behavior under extreme conditions. Investigators realized that every assumption previously made about impulsivity, about motive, about isolation, needed reconsideration. Yet, the public had seen none of this. Headlines, social media commentary, and early news reports focused on tragedy and a son's alleged involvement. Few, if any, reported on the sequence, the behavioral patterns, or the minor but critical forensic clues that painted a far more nuanced picture. Investigators understood the danger of perception. The difference between what was publicly believed and what the evidence indicated could not be overstated. Early public narratives assumed simplicity. They assumed immediacy. They assumed the story was clear. But as the report's details emerged internally, investigators recognized that reality was far from clear. And the challenge wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Jurors would later face a case layered with ambiguity. Each of the 13 details could be interpreted differently. Combined, they could suggest impulsive violence, premeditation, or the possible presence of another party. Every argument built around those facts would be colored by human perception, fear, and instinct. But before any of that could unfold, investigators had to reconcile the technical with the human. The victims were real people. The injuries, horrifying. The family torn apart. And yet, behind the case notes, the photographs, the forensic language, were human stories interrupted. The first responders, forensic teams, and behavioral analysts all acknowledged this. Data and evidence only tell part of the story. The emotional and psychological dimensions. What happened in those rooms, in those moments, were equally critical. That's what made the release of the report so volatile. When snippets leaked to the press, the public was horrified. But without context, the horror was incomplete. Readers imagined only surface details: violence, tragedy, family collapse. They did not see escalation, hesitation, sequence, interaction, or subtle traces suggesting depth, deliberation, or ambiguity. The investigative team faced a dilemma. Share too much, and the public narrative would outpace the court proceedings. Share too little, and assumptions, misinformation, and speculation would fill the gaps. Either way, perception would shape reality. And by the time the court reconvened, everyone understood this. The 13 details were not just evidence. They were a puzzle, a psychological case study, and a narrative weapon. Each detail demanded attention, interpretation, and careful presentation. Violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. It unfolds. It escalates. It builds like a storm you can sense long before it breaks. And in cases like the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the forensic details hinted at escalation in a way that was methodical, controlled, and terrifying. Think about escalation for a moment. Not just physical, but psychological. Every slight argument, every tension-filled glance, every unspoken resentment can accumulate. A human mind doesn't snap randomly. It reacts, calculates, hesitates. And that hesitation, repeated over time, often precedes catastrophic outcomes. Investigators and behavioral analysts spent hours examining the 13 horrifying details from the medical report, overlaying them onto what was known about the family dynamics. The separation of the victims' bodies, the defensive wounds, the angles of attack, and the signs of movement all suggested not only violence, but deliberation. Deliberation is chilling, because it implies intent, awareness, conscious choice. They asked themselves, how does a family conflict escalate into multiple fatal injuries, applied in sequence, with pauses, hesitation marks, and evidence of awareness of aftermath? The patterns suggested a complex interplay of emotion, thought, and impulse. Behavioral experts explained that escalation often follows predictable stages: tension, trigger, acute incident, post-incident. Tension accumulates quietly, almost imperceptibly. A trigger, sometimes minor, provokes action. The acute incident unfolds, influenced by both environment and mental state. Post-incident behavior can reveal awareness, guilt, calculation, or further detachment. In this case, the sequence of injuries suggested all four stages. The tension was unknown to the public. The trigger, if any, remained speculative, but the acute incident was recorded in the wounds. In post-incident activity, small adjustments in the scene, movement of objects, and evidence of handling the weapon implied an awareness of consequence. Investigators debated the implications. Was the escalation fueled by long-standing familial tension, by psychological instability, by a sudden breakdown in control, or was it entirely situational, driven by a single confrontation? The answer is likely a combination. But forensic and behavioral evidence suggested the presence of rational thought during the act. The hesitation marks, angles, and movements indicated a person not entirely driven by impulse. Not completely detached either, but navigating the act with awareness. Consider the psychological weight of that realization. A person in the room, inflicting multiple injuries, pausing, moving, choosing angles, leaving evidence of post-act adjustments. Each decision is a deliberate act. Each choice compounds culpability. And yet, understanding the psychology does not excuse it. It only clarifies how such tragedy can unfold in stages rather than as a sudden, singular moment of violence. Investigators also considered environmental influences. The house itself, a private, secure residence, enabled actions to occur without immediate interruption. Security systems partially disabled, lack of witnesses, and isolation of rooms provided opportunity for movement and sequence. In behavioral terms, opportunity often modulates escalation. A person may act differently if interruption is possible versus guaranteed privacy. Experts discussed intent and familiarity. Escalation in familiar environments often carries an element of control. The perpetrator knows exits, routines, and habits. Each room offers strategic advantages. Each interaction can be planned or manipulated. In this case, forensic evidence indicated movement through multiple rooms, suggesting strategic navigation rather than chaotic frenzy. They asked themselves about emotion. Was there rage? Fear? Indifference? Deliberation? Likely a combination. Psychological literature on domestic homicides reveals that multiple factors often converge: personal grievance, immediate triggers, perceived betrayal, and opportunity. In cases where the perpetrator is close to victims, escalation is amplified because intimate knowledge enables both precision and prolonged interaction. Another critical factor, the victim's responses. Defensive wounds and body positioning indicate awareness and attempts at self-protection. Their actions contribute to the dynamic. Escalation is not unidirectional, it's a feedback loop. Each movement, each defensive action, each cry or hesitation can alter the perpetrator's behavior, often intensifying the violence. Behavioral analysts emphasize that escalation does not guarantee fatality. But in this case, the combination of weapon type, repeated injuries, strategic movement, and hesitation marks points to a lethal culmination. The act was neither impulsive nor fully chaotic. It was a complex interplay of choice, reaction, and environment. Investigators also had to reconcile these psychological insights with practical observations. Security footage, phone records, witness statements, and forensic anomalies all needed alignment. Did escalation explain the sequence of movements? Did the timing discrepancies correspond to moments of hesitation? Did evidence of post-act adjustments align with the psychological stages identified? All signs suggested yes. This analysis, however, remained internal. Publicly, the narrative stayed simplified. The story, a son allegedly killed his parents. Straightforward, digestible, emotionally charged, but the psychological underpinnings were complex, layered, and revealing. By the time the investigation transitioned to formal charges, the psychology of escalation had informed every prosecutorial strategy. It guided the framing of intent. It underscored awareness during the act. It validated the interpretation of forensic patterns. And it prepared the legal team to counter potential defenses of impulsivity, emotional breakdown, or mental instability. Yet, for the public, for observers, for armchair analysts, this was invisible. The complex choreography of escalation, the stages, the pauses, the feedback loops, remained hidden behind clinical language and courtroom procedure. And that invisibility was part of what made the case haunting. Because the interplay between psychology, forensic evidence, and the sequence of events revealed not only the mechanics of the act, but also its human reality. A family destroyed, a mind navigating violence with awareness, and a series of decisions that compounded tragedy with each passing second. And as the case moved toward deeper investigation and eventual trial, one fact became undeniable. Understanding escalation wasn't just